Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to get started soon. All right, thank you everybody for joining this afternoon. I'm really excited for what we have in store today. Today we're going to be talking with Amba Kak from AI Now. AI Now has worked with academics, advocates, and policy experts to publish case studies on current attempts to regulate biometric systems like facial and voice recognition. Amba is the Director of Global Strategy and Programs, and she'll be sharing some key themes on the issues from existing legal approaches and poses open questions for the future. I'm excited to learn more about the future of policy and advocacy in this space, and would love to see where we go from here. So without further ado, we're going to play a presentation, and then we'll get together again afterwards for questions. Feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation in the session Q&A on the web app.
So hi everyone, my name is Amba Kak. I lead global policy and programs at the AI Now Institute at New York University. AI Now is a university-based, university-wide research institute at NYU. We're an organization that's committed to researching and doing advocacy around the social harms raised by AI technologies and similar forms of data-driven technologies through a combination of research, community engagement, and key policy interventions. We focus our work on 4 very broad areas, so rights and liberties, labor and automation, bias and inclusion, and safety and critical infrastructure. Our mission is to make sure that AI promotes justice and equity and is accountable to the people it is meant to or claims to serve. So today I'm going to focus on a compendium that we just released not so long ago. It feels like very long, but about a month now. It's called the Regulating Biometrics Compendium. It brings together a number of case studies from different parts of the world, giving examples and lessons learned from how governments and advocacy communities have decided to limit, restrict, or otherwise regulate the use of biometrics. But before we kind of get into the weeds of what all of that jargon means, I think I'll start with the question of what do we even mean by the word biometrics? Now, biometrics are technical systems that fix official identities to bodily or behavioral data. What that means is that it matches bodily information to a specific person and their official identity, so their name and their associated address or other demographic information. Now, fingerprints have the kind of longest history and are popularly known as a biometric, but now we've also seen the increased proliferation of face, iris, and retina scans, and more increasingly, behavioral data as well. So gait, which is how a person walks, or even keyboard or keystroke patterns. Now, the fundamental claim that's being made with biometric data is that there is a strong connection between these bodily traits and identity. In other words, these traits can be used to identify people with a high degree of accuracy and continuity over time. In other words, these fingerprints belong to a person called Amba Kak. This face belongs to a person called Amba Kak. Now, we kind of intuitively in everyday life do recognize people through their faces or how they look, how they sound. And so there's almost a kind of intuitive, yeah, that makes sense kind of feel to the whole biometrics industry. But what you see, if you look at the research over the last decades, it becomes very clear that these systems are far from perfect. They are riddled with errors, and they are also based on certain kind of assumptions that don't always hold. So for example, they perform poorly when they're used in several real life contexts, and they have unevenly distributed errors. And by that, I mean they perform less well on certain demographics versus on others, with particularly high failure rates or false positive rates for Black women, gender minorities, young and old people, members of the disabled community, and manual laborers. So the link between biometrics and the truth of identity is definitely a constructed one. And you see that it kind of gives way in these contexts. And that's really important to remember. It's a key part of the challenge to biometrics that we discuss in our compendium to ask, do these systems even work, and who do they work against? Now, I've talked a lot about kind of associating biometrics with identity, but biometrics or bodily data is also being used to answer the question, not just kind of who is that, but what type of person is that? In other words, there are claims being made in industry for tools that are able to detect your emotional state or other kinds of interior characteristics from physical or bodily information. Again, there's been a massive backlash from the research and advocacy community pointing out that many of these systems are based on both scientifically debunked as well as racist cultural assumptions about who looks like what kind of person. And this is particularly harmful because these systems have already been rolled out in hiring, in education. So who is lazy, sleepy, unmotivated, happy? Who looks confident? Who sounds like a leader? Research has shown the kind of deeply racist assumptions that are being built into these AI emotion recognition systems. So that's a kind of flavor of the various reasons why concerns have been raised and have become louder and louder, which brings us back to this compendium. It's called Regulating Biometrics, and so it's very much geared towards the policy community that's been really actively pushing back against these technologies and using the law as a tool or a weapon to push back. One of the most popular refrains in the pushback against biometric systems has been that these technologies are not inevitable. I'll say it again, that biometric technologies are not inevitable. Now, this is a really powerful statement because it goes back to what I was arguing before, that there has been this assumption of accuracy and security, the fact that biometric tools are the most accurate, they're more accurate than manual systems, and most importantly, biometric systems will keep people safe. But research over the last, I would say, 5 years has really pointed to the fact, A, who is it inaccurate for, and why is it mostly Black, brown, gender minorities, sexual minorities against whom these technologies don't work as well. But more importantly, who suffers, who is being kind of wrongfully convicted in the criminal justice system based on facial recognition evidence? Who is being locked out of access to essential welfare services or even their homes because of technical errors? And let's move away from accuracy. Let's assume the elusive 100% accurate system. Now imagine that these systems are being used against peaceful protesters in public areas. This has happened just this year in Hong Kong, in Delhi, Detroit, and Baltimore. And this has happened just in the last year. So the question then becomes, even when these systems are 100% accurate, who is using these systems against whom, and what is a power dynamic that is kind of endemic to the users of facial recognition systems, and the fact that some people are being identified and being tracked without their consent, but even without their knowledge. Now, again, I keep wanting to talk about the law, but the law in this whole space is so much a story, or the story of passing laws in this space has so much come from the advocacy around these most concerning uses. Now, like I said, these technologies are no longer or do not need to be inevitable. And maybe the purest expression of that has been in the form of laws that have been passed over the last few years that actually press pause or fully ban these technologies in particular domains. In the US in particular, there have been city and state level bans. I think the case study in the compendium puts the number at something like over 30 bans. And these moratoriums and bans have been passed after years of hard work by activists that are really doing the work of saying, nope, this is off limits. And to clarify, these bans have mostly been a ban on police or government use of facial recognition technology in particular. So it's not as if we still haven't seen the 100% banning in private and public contexts, but we've really seen progress over the last few years, and a growing demand to say we don't want data protection safeguards or other kinds of piecemeal regulation. We want a ban or nothing else. And just as an aside, a recent state bill that was passed by Washington State and actually lobbied for by Microsoft was criticized because even though in some ways it looked like some regulation of facial recognition technologies, activists argued that it was taking away kind of valuable political capital that could have gone towards actually banning these technologies. So you're seeing the kind of a wave of advocacy that has resulted in the passage of strong laws that limit and even completely ban the use of these technologies in certain contexts. But the story of the law, and this is, I think, a little more difficult for people to grasp, is not always one of just limiting or restricting technology. Sometimes the law can actually be complicit in authorizing and also kind of entrenching these systems. And that's where we look at examples from Australia or India, again, in the compendium. These are examples of where the government wants to create a centralized biometric database. In Australia, it was face. In India, it was first fingerprints and then face and iris scans. And they want to create a database of the entire population that links existing state databases and creates a kind of repository that is linked to a particular identity number. So these are called biometric ID systems. And in these cases, there was massive, and I'll take the example of India, there was massive grassroots advocacy where people argued that they didn't want the creation of this monster biometric database, and they definitely didn't want these systems to replace manual systems for welfare benefit distribution, because they were finding that the elderly or manual laborers who work with their hands were being rejected by these systems, and they definitely didn't want it to become the only option. Now, in the face of this kind of pushback and this advocacy, the government, and there was also a number of court cases filed before the Constitutional Court, arguing that these systems went against the constitutional right to privacy. And in response, the court said, okay, well, we'll pass a law and then it'll be legal and it'll all be okay. So they passed a law, which was kind of, a hurriedly passed the law through Parliament. And we all know that, you can't rely solely on the democratic process of Parliament or in the case of the US, the Senate, to kind of secure the expression of democratic will. And so you ended up with a law that was really used as a kind of band-aid over a problem that couldn't be solved through kind of these kind of minor fixes. And so I guess what I would say to conclude that section is that the law is a complex tool. It can be used to limit systems, but it can also be used, depending on what the law says, by governments to kind of stave off the risk of a ban or a complete destruction of the biometric database. And it can be used as a kind of band-aid, like I said, or a way to evade more structural challenges. And maybe I will kind of just end by giving a few quick examples of lessons that we learned from this. I learned particularly kind of editing this compendium and bringing together examples from the UK, from India, Australia, from Europe at the European Union level, and even from international organizations like the Red Cross that work with biometric data of refugees. So what are some lessons I learned? Well, one, and this is actually from Woody Herzog's chapter, and he wrote about the Illinois state BIPA law, and that's the Biometric Information Privacy Act. He said this act has been so successful in terms of many lawsuits have been filed against some of the largest tech companies in the world, arguing that consent was not taken. But the lesson I got from that and from the argument he makes is that consent can only go so far, that it is a broken tool in an environment where you cannot rely on people to always opt out of giving their data, especially when the choice or the illusory choice to say no means that you're denied the service. And so he argues, and it's a powerful lesson, that you really need to go beyond consent to making sure that you actually have bright line restrictions which decide when biometric data can be used and when it just shouldn't. And that shouldn't be left to the individual or the individual consumer. The other really interesting lesson was from the chapter on the International Red Cross by Ben Hayes and Massimo Morelli, who are actually from the ICRC. And they argued that sometimes it's a question of kind of balancing or proportionality. So, okay, you want to use biometrics, but in the case of the ICRC or the Red Cross, they found that creating a database of biometrics was creating a huge honeypot where kind of oppressive governments wanted access to the biometric data of refugees. So they said that our real problem is like, we don't want to store this. We want to use this biometric information to distribute aid to people who are in need of humanitarian assistance and make sure they're not giving the same person, aid twice. But after that, we delete the data and we do not retain the data so that it isn't open. There aren't kind of vested interest or problematic actors who have interest in them. And so their ICRC policy or law actually outlines the many ways in which, it's called the database minimization policy. And maybe the final one, since this is an event which in another world would be happening in New York City, is the example of Rashida Richardson and Stephanie Coyle's chapter, which talks about the community-driven advocacy that led to the New York State moratorium or pause on the use of facial recognition in schools. So they kind of track or do an ethnography of how a group of parents organized against the Lockport school district's decision to purchase and deploy facial recognition in schools. And so it was the parents who took the initiative, showed up to those meetings, and they really shifted the discourse from kind of debating whether biometric systems were necessary to really focus on the real harms of privacy to students if the school district decided to move forward. Most importantly, they were like, face recognition systems in schools won't make our children safer, and in many ways, they will play into the racialized security dynamics that are playing out in public schools. Eventually, and this happened actually after the report went into so-called print, we learned that the New York State had actually passed this bill. When they wrote the paper, it was still being introduced. So I think that's a good note to end on, because this space is rapidly changing. There's advocacy happening all over the world, but particularly in the US, it's really heating up. And communities are taking an active part in convincing lawmakers and city council governments to really restrict the use of these systems, particularly in public spaces. I'll end there, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Amba. That was amazing. And thank you for joining us for the Q&A. As you would expect, we have a lot of questions. This is all very intriguing and enlightening. Any quick thoughts before I jump into the questions, Amba, if there was anything else that you'd like to add from that?
No, I think we can move to the Q&A.
Great. So as you mentioned, biometrics covers a range of technologies that are ubiquitous. Do you have a call to action for everyday users of tech?
For everyday users, well, I guess the first thing I'd say is, do we use the term everyday user to include, those individuals and groups who kind of don't have a choice but are subject to biometric technologies? Sure. Because, so many of the examples I gave in the talk as well they're about people who are subject to these technologies every day as part of the criminal justice system or as part of their, their process of being tenants to enter their buildings, but they don't really have a choice. And it feels like the term everyday users is usually not talking about those types of individuals and groups, but more talking about kind of your, should I be using Face ID to unlock my phone? So yeah, maybe I'll start with the Face ID example because it's probably the most relatable to many of us on this call. I'd say like it's a good place to start the conversation, particularly, you know, kind of with your family or your friends about kind of what is the relationship or what might be the dangers of a biometric system. Now, Face ID on your iPhone or other device is I would say in some senses a benign form of use, just because it's local storage and you know, it is for the most part meaningfully opt-in.
You're not
But at the
screaming
same
from the
time,
mountaintops for everyone to turn those off or disable those just yet.
sorry?
So you're not screaming for everyone to turn that off as far as like a call to action.
No. I was just gonna get there. Like I don't think that's the most urgent call to action. No, but on the other hand, there are ways in which it is like normalizing biometric or biometric capture, and that's something to. I'm not saying you need to act on it today, but it's something to think about. The other thing, and that's what security experts have repeatedly pointed out, is that it is actually weaker security than a passcode, and that's probably demonstrated by the fact that there is legal precedent that, you know, the police can't force you to give your password or your passcode, but they can force you to unlock your phone using your Face ID or your thumbprint. And in fact, if you're kind of, you know, even if you're out of it or you're you know, you're passed out, you could still be your thumbprint or your Face ID might still be used without your consent or knowledge. So anyway, that's all to say that I think even in this like somewhat benign example, if there is you know, if you are at risk of being prosecuted or otherwise you're concerned about your security in public life, then that's something to think about. And maybe just quickly as a broader call to action, I would say like the most important thing right now, and I think particularly for the demographic that's probably on this call, is to kind of get involved and support and provide solidarity for the groups that don't have choices and the advocacy groups that are kind of organizing on their behalf, and including not just on their behalf, but also community groups that are galvanizing to push back against biometrics. So I'll give two New York examples. The first is the Atlantic Towers Tenant Association. They're in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, in Brooklyn, and they've been on the front lines with their neighbors resisting the use of face recognition technology in their apartment complex pretty successfully. There's also the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, and I'm happy to find a way to kind of share some of these links later as well. Outside of New York, there is Tawana Petty is leading an incredible campaign in Detroit and showing up to city council meetings, you know, every other week. Just this week, there was a major moment which was sort of unsuccessful, but they're kind of showing up and making their voices heard, and kind of adding their voice to the ban these technologies, particularly when these technologies are being used by police or government.
Thank you very, very much. So you mentioned inevitable, that these are not inevitable technologies, and that came up in the questions as well. So someone asked from the audience, as long as these systems themselves that are biased benefit from these technologies and they maintain that power, how can they not be inevitable? Yeah,
that's an excellent question, because like I think the path dependency, or if you look at, say, the biometric industry, it's called the Biometric Industry Report. It's pretty literal. The one that comes out every year, they just show you this linear trajectory of an expanding industry. And they notice, I noticed that the one that came out for 2018, 2019 had a section which said, this market is growing. We're going from face to gate to iris scan to vein patterns, like, you know, this is the next big thing. And our largest client is the public sector, which was immediately kind of surprising to me. And it said they kind of made up the biggest pie of the revenues for the sector, as well as the projected revenues. And then you look at the advocacy movement, so much of which is concentrated on the use of these technologies by the public sector. And you've already had, like, you know, more than 35 bans and moratoriums in the US at city and state levels just this year. And it tells you that these are signals which the industry cannot ignore. And I think the power of these signals, even though they're not nationwide bans, cannot be overstated. So it does not surprise me that the people that are thinking about investing in this industry 5 years from now will be worried if they hear, as they would have heard, that there is a groundswell of advocacy that is pushing back against these technologies. I'm not trying to be overly optimistic to say that the powers that be are going to get scared off, but I also think that we shouldn't be too pessimistic about the ways in which business, more than we think, also have their ear to the ground to see kind of which way the trend is going. And it seems like we've come from a place when biometrics were like, yeah, it seems like it's a cool new technology, to these are kind of creepy. And I think even that shift can hugely shape the market dynamics around this space.
Yes, and the advocacy screaming that it is creepy needs to get into the boards and the minds of the C-suites and those industries, and saying like, oh, maybe we shouldn't just jump on this novelty just because we think it's cool, right?
If not for ethical reasons, then even just because of the fear of regulation or the fear that their business would be shut down in a few years.
Great. So another question we have here: when a biometric is deemed appropriate use and therefore its collection is warranted, what kind of security mechanisms exist to protect the data from ill-intended use?
Yeah, so I mean, this would depend on where we're talking about. In the US, we don't have a kind of federal Biometric Information Privacy Act, but I can give you an example of the Illinois BIPA law, and that's one that does apply to biometric information collected by private actors. And there they have a kind of very sort of broad and vague stipulation, which says that vendors or organizations or firms need to implement reasonable security practices. And if I look at the kind of EU or several of the other biometrics regulations in this compendium, they all have like security protocols listed as one of the most important things, because, you know, biometrics are not like passwords. They can't just be changed. It's your, you know, once your fingerprint's been forged, like it's really, you can't get a new fingerprint. And so everyone recognizes that the fear of a security breach is, you know, at the maximum risk level when it comes to biometrics, but there isn't, the laws themselves don't stipulate what those security standards are. I know that there are various standard setting bodies, including NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or maybe I'm getting the acronym wrong, but there are technical standard setting bodies that work on figuring out these standards and have done a lot of good work on this, IEEE as well. So you can look to there, but I guess what I take away from a lot of that is that for a smaller business that's getting into the biometrics trade, there aren't very clear stipulations apart from saying you must take care of this because it's highly sensitive. And the truth is, and any security expert will tell you this themselves, there is no such thing as a 100% secure system. And so one of the questions we need to be asking, particularly with, you know, these kind of big centralized biometric databases, is like, is this a honeypot we want to even create? And do the risks outweigh the benefits?
And yeah, that's a scary thought, because it is going to be a honeypot, regardless of, you know, your intended use. You know, just the wealth of data is going to be scary. There is another presenter tomorrow on a Friday that's collecting 3D body scans, called N3D. And I think he said that he has the largest database of body data, like full bodies. And that again, that's going to be another honeypot that we need to.
Yeah, I'm going to show up to that and ask a question. Thank you for alerting me to that.
Yes, Sergey Sherman with N3D. Go check that one out on day 3. So your work, along with the MIT study, identified 3 commercial gender recognition systems that found errors particularly with dark-skinned women of 30%, 34% I saw higher than their, you know, other counterparts. What technology enhancements need to happen to kind of mitigate this bias in the AI or the algorithms, so that, you know, and maybe you could explain to us why is it that there's so much bias in the pigmentation and the dark skin, in recognizing facial expressions and other things?
Mm-hmm. So first, I want to clarify that this research was done by Joy Bolomi, Timnit Gebru, and Deborah Raji. So I've cited to it in in the biometrics compendium. And that research, Gender Shades, was, and several papers that have come out since and are cited in my compendium as well, they were kind of a seminal moment and an existential threat to the biometrics industry, because the claim was always these systems are accurate, and they were like, no, they're not actually accurate for everyone, and actually for most people, if you look at the numbers, and if you look at it globally in particular, then I think then I would say even more so. So now you asked two things. One was like, why are they biased? And B, like, how can it be fixed, or how can it be fixed? So now on the question on why they are biased, the kind of technical or immediate answer is that the training data is the term of art, but the training data, or the data on which these machine learning algorithms, facial recognition algorithms are trained, the data itself is kind of white male faces are overrepresented in that database. So the algorithm trains on these particular faces. It shapes what the algorithm recognizes as a face, what they recognize, and particularly what they kind of set the bar for what is recognized as normal, and that kind of affects the way in which these systems perform against other groups. And there's both the question of being kind of excluded or locked out, as well as the kind of concern of false positives, where, you know, it might think that two brown faces look very similar, and so you might be falsely accused. And that's what we've seen happen in the criminal justice system, and which has led to several wrongful convictions based on incorrect false positive evidence. Now, the other question for like why these systems are biased, because that kind of tells you like, oh, it's a data problem, is also like we've done a report called Discriminating Systems, which says who are the people building these systems and what are the demographics of that industry. And the industry that is building these tools is also predominantly white male and based in a certain part of the US. And they're building these technologies for the rest of the world. And so sometimes you can call it oversight, you can call it kind of your own bias, but it's clear that the pipeline of people building these technologies also have certain inbuilt biases, and that kind of strengthens the call to diversify the pipeline and not just think about fixing the training data problem. And I think that sort of is a good segue into the last question, which is, you know, can you fix it? In response to the work that Joy and others have done, there have been calls to have kind of audit systems in particular that kind of audit systems and test their accuracy against different demographic groups, and therefore create that kind of reflexivity to diversify training data sets and so on. But in response to that, there's also been a very strong advocacy call which says, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be trying to make 100% accurate systems, because let's think of how these examples are used. They're being used in protests to, you know, persecute, peaceful protesters, or they're being used in other kind of circumstances, by organizations that have power against individuals or groups that don't. And so 100% accurate system might not always be the right advocacy call or the right kind of call to action for the future.
And what's scary with that is that if people trust that it's 100% accurate, when it's inaccurate, no one's going to believe it, right? And when it does those false positives, you know, when we rely on it to be so accurate. Where do you see the beneficial best practices of biometrics, i.e. ideas like blockchain ID affirmation for refugees, where traditional documentation may not exist?
Yeah, so I would I'm going to refrain from getting into the question of blockchain, because it isn't my area of expertise beyond kind of healthy skepticism of throwing blockchain on it. But I won't say more since I'm not as familiar. But I would kind of refer the person who asked that question to the essay in our compendium, which is by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which I mentioned, on refugees. They go through their thought process on how they decided that in that particular situation, it wasn't necessary, but it was the best possible way to identify people who came to the border without any papers was to use their biometric data. At the same time, they realized that the data that they were collecting from refugees, particularly when they might be political refugees, would be highly sensitive data, and it would be data that their home country governments might want access to, or could be used by other governments to persecute them. And so they created a system where they deduplicated the data of refugees and used it for disbursement of welfare benefits and other emergency assistance. But they had a system where they didn't store the data for beyond that period, and they didn't kind of retain or create a database, and they had that database minimization policy. So I would say that I think the proportionality principle in law is a really good one for these circumstances, to ask, is this the least intrusive way for me to identify someone? And if it is, go ahead and use it with safeguards. But if it isn't, find other ways to do it, because I think there are a whole host of security and other reasons that would bolster why.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So now that we're in a society where like wearing masks has become normalized due to COVID and staying safe, do you see this also normalizing wearing masks to protect themselves from facial recognition, or will that be outlawed?
Yeah, good question. I saw this on Twitter, I'd say like 6 weeks ago, and I don't have a better source than Twitter, but I did see that a facial recognition company has announced that they have kind of updated their algorithms to be able to detect faces even with the mask on. And the kind of cruel irony of this all is that, even as the pandemic was raging, and before the pandemic was raging in Hong Kong and in Delhi, there were massive political protests on various issues, pro-democracy, pro-secularism protests. And, a lot of people were wearing masks. And at that time, they were wearing masks because they were afraid that the facial recognition cameras would get them. And then a couple of months later, we're in the pandemic, you have the Black Lives Matter protests in New York, everyone's wearing masks, and the police can't tell them not to because they have to by law. So I think it's a confluence of the mess that is 2020, but also a reminder that I think these kinds of reactive solutions of like we'll wear a mask and obscure ourselves to the cameras are not permanent solutions, just like consent is not. You can't leave it up to individuals to protect themselves against systems when the power imbalance is so great.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw, there was a protester that became so popular and like legendary because no one knew what he looked like, and they saw him everywhere. And then ended up, it was like 4 or 5 of them wearing the same mask. All over the place. It's going to become trickier. I think I might get a mask myself.
If you don't have one already,
yeah,
you see that we're in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah. So we think policy and advocacy requires diverse coalition building. How do you see the role of research and advocacy to make change and work with a range of stakeholders, policymakers, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would refer this person, because I mean, it's a question that we grapple with, and particularly as part of AI Now, we're in a kind of research institute. And so the question is, like, research has always been such an elite space, and also hasn't done enough, I would say, institutionally to reach out or to connect their research and make it kind of more engaged and feed into advocacy. But I do think that that's changing in important ways. And just as one example, the New York City government created this ADS, Automated Decision System Task Force. And they were meant to create kind of, New York was going to be the first city in the world to create a task force to think about when should you use automated systems, when not, and it was supposed to be this big consultative process. But the main thing that they missed is that they did zero community outreach. So they were like, yeah, we're going to hold meetings, but no one knew when the meetings were. Like, why is someone going to take off work and get their pay cut so that they can come for a meeting when they don't even know what people are talking about or why this matters? So it kind of showed the ways in which community participation can be weaponized, and then, it can be like, oh, nobody showed up, but we did community participation, and became like a checkbox. And in response, interestingly, there were about 25 organizations, and AI Now kind of led a coalition of groups, and they did a shadow report where they were like, this committee isn't doing enough, or isn't particularly on the consultation side, isn't doing enough. So they created their own process, and as an output for that, they organized community meetings in Riverside Church in Harlem, and invited a lot of different groups that were working not on algorithms, but were working on education, on healthcare, on child welfare. So domains, social workers that were working in these domains and were worried about the impact of algorithms in their spaces. And for me, I mean, I attended that as a kind of visitor, and it was really, really interesting and important to see kind of research translate into a moment which was kind of, you know, educational on both sides. It was educational for those that work on trying to understand these technical systems, but it was to try to understand how do they actually translate and what are the fears that people who relate to these systems directly have, and also the other way around. So I do think that there are interesting innovations, and I would urge you to look at the shadow report of the New York City ADS task force. It's a brilliant document, and it discusses some of this community engagement.
Yeah, I sit on the board, ambassador board for OpenAI's GPT-3, and looking at the social impact and ethical use. And you know, we've brought up some interesting issues within our private Slack of like how to use it and how not to use it. And it brings up some interesting questions as to, you know, how we use it is not up to us. People are gonna, you know, do some crazy things with it, you know, and it brings up some tricky questions. So these next questions, these next two are kind of connected, so I'll ask them together. Biometrics is one, and we think of neural interfaces like Elon Musk Neuralink. They're all sort of terrifying and dystopian. Any thoughts on the next wave of neural interfaces? In addition to that, like RFID implants and the biometric data with RFID, like chips, is that in our future, or where do you see this kind of space going in the next 5–10 years?
So people always ask us why our institute is called AI Now. And they're like, that's a weird name for like a critical organization. And the reason we called it that, and it kind of, I'm going to get to the question, is because it's, people are always like, what's the next thing? Like, you know, what are we gonna, yeah, like what is the future gonna look like? What's that dystopia? What is artificial general intelligence and all of these things, self-driving cars? Those are the kind of paradigm examples of tech dystopia. And it was always like, no, we don't want to talk about AI now, then we want to talk about AI now. And there's already a lot of scary stuff, I think, which is, you know, it's not so much a threshold of how technically advanced it is, but really about how intrusive or how the kind of social impacts it has. So I'll give you two examples that kind of are currently proliferating, which scare me and are also part of our research agenda. So one is moving from facial recognition to what I mentioned, which was emotion AI. So tools that are kind of detecting your emotional state, and those are being used and have already been rolled out in many large firms' hiring practices. They're also being now rolled out in schools to determine when students are paying attention and when they aren't. To me, like, I think 5 years ago, if you told me this was a thing, I would be like, that's crazy. Like that, you know, if you think that CCTVs have a chilling effect on freedom of speech or, you know, freedom in the classroom, I can't imagine what systems that are constantly evaluating whether you look, you know, normal or interested or confident might do. And I think the other one, which is someone recently asked me, like, in the sphere of biometrics, what is the most scary thing you learned? And I think it was looking at the biometric industry update website, because they always have these new articles on, you know, what's the next big thing. And they would talk about how credit card companies like MasterCard are already thinking of vein analysis as one way of authenticating for payment or credit services. And I guess, and there's nothing like particularly worse when it comes to vein versus face, but I think the reason it got to me is like thinking about the ways in which technology trajectories will try to datafy and digitize every part of the human body. And I think the question that we need to ask as society is that inevitability question. It's like, do we want to, you know, is it a kind of linear path dependency to more datafication and more automation, or can we have a kind of social conversation or a kind of more democratic conversation around, do we need these technologies, and what is the future that we're kind of mindlessly moving towards?
That's all I have is a sigh for that, because it's like, there's no need for that. And I know like we're headed down that way because they're just going to find more fast and convenient ways to process, you know, at point of sales, but it's not needed. As you said, it doesn't have to be inevitable, right? So speaking of next, what's next for you and your team, and what other areas are you looking to research and explore next?
So yeah, we have a lot on our plate. We're a team of almost 20 people, but I'll just give some of the stuff that's live on our website and is more interactive. So if you Google landlord tech, that's our new project, and we're collaborating with the anti-eviction mapping project to look at how, in the wake of COVID in particular, landlords and other kinds of property agents across the states are using kind of invasive technology, surveillance, and AI tools to try to evict tenants. And so tenant organizing groups and housing justice groups are organizing just to get a landscape of what is being used, where. And so if you have examples of where you think your landlord might be using surveillance, that's a good tool you can use, and it also provides some resources as well. The second thing we're doing is we're looking at kind of the future of the emotional AI market segment, but particularly kind of using patents as a research method and seeing like what are the patents that are being filed today, and what does that tell us about the future and how responsive it is to the public conversation about the harms of these systems. And then we have a lot of work happening right now on labor. So we're looking, a lot of the conversation about AI and labor is about how AI is going to take up everyone's jobs, and like AI is going to replace, the bots are going to replace human beings. And those debates are important, but we are actually focusing on the ways in which algorithmic tools are being used to manage workers, particularly low-paid workers in warehouses, like the Amazon warehouse and other kind of gig worker workspaces. So looking both at worker surveillance, but how it's determining their wage rate, promotions, appraisals, and that kind of thing. And relatedly, another labor question is, you know, what about the unseen labor that goes into labeling, training data sets? And, you know, what about those human beings whose labor is actually sustaining this so-called automated industry? What are the material conditions under which these people are working? Many of them are working in global South regions, like South and Southeast Asia. And so, you know, what are the consequences or global justice questions that this industry raises, and how is it going to impact those regions and their economies?
Well, great. I'm
so yeah,
excited.
that's I'm not going to go on, but that's just to give
Yeah,
you
is that all you're working on? Well, Amba, this was truly a pleasure. I learned a lot today. There's a lot of things that I'm going to do to follow up and do some homework. If you have any additional questions from the audience, please ask them in the session Q&A and in the chat. And we would love to follow up with Amba. Amba, you're more than welcome to join in on those conversations as well on the web app. Thank you again for your time today. And we look forward to more research coming out of AI now. And I will certainly be paying attention, and I'll be buying my mask tomorrow to protect myself.
And thank you so much, Erica, for putting this together.
All right. Take care.
Cheers.